back in Babylon as slaves. So Daniel is the story about this, essentially the 70-year period when Israel is in this awful state, when faith is lacking in so many and it looks so dark for Israel. So this is how God sustains his people through the darkest times of their lives. So chapter 6, verse 1. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom. So Darius the Mede, again, as we see from verse 31 of the previous chapter, he's called Darius the Mede. Here mentions this Darius. This is a name given to the man Cyrus sets up as ruler in Babylon. Cyrus is the main king of the now dominant superpower once Babylon is gone. The kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. Cyrus unites the kingdom of the Medes with the Persians and makes a superpower. Darius seems to have been born a Mede, but he is used by Cyrus as a commanding general. Now, the name Darius does not appear in non-biblical historical sources. And there aren't a lot of non-biblical historical sources from this period in time, so it's not surprising. But nonetheless, what this person does in Babylon does appear, just under a different name. And as we said last week, it's not surprising, because back at this time, they had multiple names. Daniel himself, was called Belshazzar by Nebuchadnezzar. So they had their Babylonian names, and they had his Israeli name, his Jewish name. Here, Darius, we're told, is a Mede, so he has his Mede name, and he has his Persian name. I think Darius is probably the Persian name, but he's specifically called the Mede. We know what the name of this guy was, who was the presiding general who did sack Babylon, from the extra biblical sources. His name is Gubaru, as you see. So he is undoubtedly Darius the Mede, the Persian general who sacked Babylon. And he sets up his kingdom there on Cyrus's behalf. He's kind of the ultimate king, but Darius serves under him as the ruler in this place. So Darius sets over the kingdom of Babylon 120 satraps. So a new organizational structure makes sense, considering the fact that Babylon was just sacked and taken over by the Medo-Persian Empire. And such a reorganization is actually confirmed in the non-biblical sources. And the name of the thing is called the Annalistic Tablet of Cyrus that they have found, which says that the new Persian ruler did appoint governors in Babylon. So we do actually have confirmation from a non-biblical source, not that we need it, that does say that when Babylon was sacked, the new rulers set up a whole new organizational structure with new governors. Here's the biblical story of it. Second asterisk on your handout. Take a quick peek in Jeremiah. Jeremiah 51:11. It's an interesting thing that kind of makes sense of what's going on in Daniel. 51:11. Jeremiah 51:11. Make the arrows bright, gather the shields. The Lord has raised up the spirit of the kings of the Medes, for his plan is against Babylon to destroy it, because it is the vengeance of the Lord, the vengeance for his temple. What we're seeing happen in Daniel is the fulfillment of this, that God had planned all along that the Medes and Persians would sack Babylon as vengeance, as God's vengeance, an instrument of his vengeance, because of their desecration of the temple. It was Nebuchadnezzar who ultimately sacked the temple and carried all of its stuff back to Babylon. And from the last chapter, you remember, it was Belteshazzar who took those articles from the temple, brought them into a drunken orgy, and had all his guests drink from them, just as the ultimate desecration of God's sacred things. So the Babylonians, both in the beginning of the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar and the end of it under Belteshazzar, made a point of desecrating God's temple. So what we see happening now under Darius is God's answer to what happens when you desecrate his temple. He wipes you out, and he recreates a whole new government. From this point on, the Babylonian Empire is gone. The Persians wipe it out, and they take it over. So on the handout then under that asterisk, it's pretty much summaries of that. All right, verses 2 to 3, Daniel chapter 6. And over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So from chapter 5, the previous chapter, just before Babylon gets sacked, in fact, the night Babylon is sacked, Belteshazzar makes Daniel third in the kingdom of Babylon. Dresses him in a purple robe, puts a gold chain on him, makes him an official. So by the time Babylon is taken over by this Darius fellow, Babylon has Daniel as third in command. So it only makes sense, really, that Daniel would be included in the new structure, because he's familiar with the governance of Babylon, obviously. He's lived there virtually his whole life, brought over as a very young man. And remember, by this point, Daniel is probably in his 70s, if not even early 80s. Especially for that period in time, he is ancient. Do you know in the first century, under the Romans, the average life expectancy was in your mid-20s? And the reason for that is mostly because of infanticide, very high infanticide rate. But yeah, very low life expectancies. We don't appreciate how truly amazing it is that somebody lived at that age at that period in history. So Daniel gets picked as one of the 3 main governors, so that the king would suffer no loss. End of verse 2. Meaning, Darius was a pretty savvy guy. He knew that in this kind of regime change period, that's when your greedy slime balls are going to try and capitalize on the situation and get rich. So that's when the ugliness of people and their dishonesty and greed are going to come out the most clearly, and they're going to steal blind whatever they can. And we see that every single time there's a regime change anywhere in the world, especially that part of the world. You know, Afghanistan, when that went down, you have all these stories of leaders going away with van loads full of $100 bills that they've stolen from the U.S., the money that was supposed to go to rebuilding. You know, that's typical of a regime change. So Darius knows that's going to happen. So he doesn't want the king to suffer any loss. So he sets up this structure to stop it. And he's expecting Daniel as one of the top 3 to be a guy who's willing to stop it, which means Daniel was a pretty good businessman and a pretty good governor. Because this is the worst time in the history of any place to be a governor, when there's that kind of chaos. But he had to be a pretty tough guy, too, that people respected enough that they didn't want to steal, under his watch. All right, so Daniel gets set up. He's one of the main governors now. Verse 4 and 5. So the governors and satraps sought to find a charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom. But they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any charge against Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God." So the question is, why are the other governors and satraps suddenly trying to dislodge Daniel and get him out of the way. And there's so many possible reasons. These are probably the guys who wanted to do the stealing, and Daniel was kind of in the way of them doing what they wanted to do. He's also a Jew. They're all Chaldeans or, Assyrians. So that's Jews, a foreigner. They hated the Jews back then. This is modern day Iran, by the way, Babylon. So these are Iranians hating Jews. There's a new thing you've never heard of before. It's funny. More than 2,000 years. This is like 3,000 years that they've been hating each other like this. So they're looking to get rid of Daniel, long-standing hatred. They couldn't do it under Nebuchadnezzar. Or even as long as Babylon was alive, they couldn't get rid of him. Because Nebuchadnezzar passed, I think it was in chapter 3, an official decree that nobody messes with Daniel or his God. So Daniel had legal protection under the Babylonian government. Now that the Babylonian government is no longer in power and it's the Persian government, that's their opportunity. The old Babylonian laws protecting Daniel because of his religion don't apply anymore. So they seize on this opportunity to finally get rid of somebody who's been standing in their way the whole time, preventing them from having the kind of life they wanted to have because he was too honest. So jealousy of power, motivation for their deceit. Also note on the handout, the asterisks there, a mark of godliness is being open, honest, and law-abiding in one's dealings. Yeah, they couldn't find anything to bring against Daniel. He was too honest. An honest government official. A unicorn. That was mean. There's plenty of honest government officials out there. Just not a whole lot of them in Washington. All right, so a mark of godliness, open, honest, law-abiding. So Daniel is a good model of faith. And this is how the world perceives faith, our faith. And we should never underestimate the power of that witness in a godless world. Because here they noticed it and hated it. It bespoke the God that Daniel followed, because Darius is going to call him is it the holy God or the living God? I think he calls him the holy God. At any rate, previously too, the Babylonians referred to Daniel's God as the holy God. Well, Daniel reflected that in his life. They knew his God by virtue of Daniel's life being stamped with that holiness. So the world might not know your God or understand Jesus or anything like that. But based on your life, they will see him in you. So it's a reminder of how strong that witness really is. Verses 6 to 9. So these governors and satraps thronged before the kings and said to him, King Darius, live forever. All the governors and kingdoms, administrators and satraps, the counselors and the advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make firm the decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree, sign the writing so that it cannot be changed according to the law which the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree. All right. Now remember, Darius is new to the post of being the ruler here in Babylon. He doesn't know the long-standing history of these satraps and Daniel. In this short amount of time, though, he had taken notice of Daniel and actually really had a strong affection for Daniel, because Daniel was such a rare beast that Darius really took a liking to him. He was trustworthy in a world where you couldn't trust anybody. So he doesn't know all of the intrigue going on behind the scenes, so he signs this law, making himself a god. The arrogance of men. So on the handout, just a couple of things to note. One, deceit is the mark of godlessness. They know exactly what their decree is going to do to Daniel. Remember that Daniel was untouchable for theological reasons under the Babylonian kings, and that's what we just talked about with Nebuchadnezzar's decree. With the change in world powers, the former decrees of the Babylon kings no longer are in force, so they're free to attack Daniel on theological grounds, which they do. It also speaks well of Daniel and his confession of faith. Daniel was so open with his faith that even unbelievers knew what he would and wouldn't do in service to his God. They all knew he wouldn't bow down to the new king and worship him. Our text says, verse 6, how these governors and satraps thronged before the king. The word throng in Hebrew means to be in tumult, to show tumultuousness. So they came in there as kind of an agitated mob. This wasn't a reasonable crowd of people. They used emotion on their side. And note, too, the attack on prayer. This is really an attack on prayer. That in verse 7 there, that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days except you. That is, pray, a petition. Whoever prays to any other god or man except you. So their main focus of attack is prayer. I thought this was an interesting comment from an older commentator, a guy named Leupold. He says this: Havernek's remarks on the subject of the place of prayer in the Persian religion throws an interesting sidelight on the whole situation. Prayer was the chief factor in worship. A great part of the holy things of the Persians contains only formulas of prayers and certain types of litanies. Prayer is regarded as irresistible, as operating with a certain magic power. To omit prayer would mean the collapse of the world. So they were very much into not doing anything without the petition of their God. Gods, plural. Note the psychological tactics they use that we still see prevalent in the world. It says, all the governors of the kingdom, administrators, satraps, the counselors, advisors have all consulted together. Our text said, all consulted together. They all were in this thing together. And they come to the king that everybody is on their side. We all agree on this thing, putting pressure on him by virtue of numbers. And you see that kind of thing all the time. You see it in politics, claiming to have the numbers on your side. Yeah. You see it in the church, sad to say. People who want something in the church very often come up with, I've gotten so many phone calls and talked to so many people who agree with me on this. You hear that kind of playing to the numbers thing. Whether it's right or wrong doesn't seem to matter. What matters is how many people you got on your side. So nothing changes, and that's exactly the tactic they use to try and manipulate Darius. And it works. B, another thing to note, the psychological games, working behind the scenes for consensus, so when you come together, you've got a majority on your side. Again, not open and honest like Daniel is, but in the shadows, making these backstreet deals. C, flattery, getting somebody on your good side, O king, live forever. That was the typical way of greeting the Babylonian kings. What a great way to suck up to somebody. D, make it look like it's to honor or help someone else, when really it's about harming somebody else. We're doing this to honor, establish your power as the God King. That's kind of how they approach this. And E, use the letter of the law to your favor against your enemies. Sign the writing so it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians. So evidently when a king wrote something, as the Persian ruler in that place, it was an unchangeable law. Kind of like, when the Pope issues a decree called ex cathedra, an official statement of Pope, it's considered canon law and really can't be changed. It's infallible. If he makes some comment on the side as whatever the guy's name is now, not official statement as Pope, that's not an ex cathedra thing, and he can be wrong on that. But when he makes an official legal declaration as Pope, that's infallible. So here, if they can get him to make an official decree as the Persian ruler of that place, then that becomes unchangeable. It's a unique legal status that they know how to manipulate to their favor. So he does. Verse 9, he signs it. He doesn't know what he's signing. Any thoughts, any comments before we press on? All right, talkative bunch today. All right, there we go. Way to break the ice.
Probably way off the mark, but comparison, Darius, there's a movie out, it's called 300.
Yep.
He's a Persian king.
Okay.
And
Xerxes.
Does that belong in the same?
Xerxes will eventually follow, yeah. I mean, Xerxes is a real guy. He will, in fact, the book of Esther in the Old Testament, Xerxes follows Cyrus, who sacks Babylon. Xerxes will come later. Cyrus's official title was Cyrus the Great. They always have the Great after it. Xerxes, I think, is just Xerxes. But yeah, at that point in time, under Cyrus and Xerxes both, Persia is thought to be an unstoppable army. They are the superpower. And I think that movie, The 300, which is a fictitious telling of the story of Thermopylae, in which 300 Spartans stood against the Persian war machine. There were 1 million Persian army, is what they said historically, that 300 Spartans stood against. Yeah. But that's Persia. They were powerful. Okay, verse 10. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home in his upper room with the windows open toward Jerusalem, knelt down on his knees 3 times a day, and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. So Daniel doesn't change a thing in his devotional practice. He's not doing something new to be extra defiant. He's just keeping on with the same devotional practice as always, completely unaffected by a decree that tells him he can't pray. What a man of courage he was. And that little note of when Daniel knew the writing was signed, shows he knew he was about to take his life in his hands and maybe even die because of this. This is an act of sheer courage. The asterisks underneath the verse on the handout, this explains how the other evil governors knew Daniel would be caught by their plot. They all saw his daily practice. He did this every single day, 3 times a day. So they knew it. In fact, I wouldn't be a bit surprised if they were all waiting outside his window, just waiting to see him do it. Daniel could have continued praying in secret to God simply by keeping his window closed, and no one would have known he was violating the decree. So, why would that have been wrong to do? A person could easily justify that. I'm still praying to God. Why would it have been wrong for Daniel to close the window? They might have, yeah.
They were setting up a trap, so I'm pretty sure they would have set up some sort of situation at some point.
That could very well be. Yeah.
It would show a lack of trust in God.
It would show lack of faith. Yeah. It would make a confession that was contrary to the faith, in a way.
Did the underground church in China make a confession in that way?
That's a good question. Even Yeah, and the whole even the word is almost an oxymoron. Underground church. You know, church isn't supposed to be underground. It's supposed to be in the wide open, like Daniel was. But you know, and I suppose in Roman times when Christianity was illegal, their answer at that point in time was to continue worshiping. And they did it sometimes in house churches, but it was never really secretive, I don't think. Yeah, Christians there's something about being open in our confession of the truth, even if it's going to cost you your life, that bespeaks the trust we have in God over our enemies and over death itself. And to fear death and fear man more than God is a wrong confession. So yeah, what about the underground church in China? I don't fault them for doing it. You know, I don't want to say they're necessarily wrong, but there is something not right about it too, about trying to hide. And it's not in China, at least to what I understand, it's not like this, where if they catch you doing Christianity, you're going to kill you. It's more, you're going to lose all your social credits and, you know, health care and food stamps and whatever else the government was offering.
So it seems less serious than
It's probably less serious than what Daniel was facing, yeah.
The early Christians used the sign of the fish to mark their...
Yeah, that too. That was one way they communicated without making it obvious. I mean, they didn't go out of their way to announce, here I am, a big Christian, come and kill me, just like Daniel doesn't. It specifically says in here, this was always been his practice. He's not doing anything different or new to draw attention to himself. He's just doing what he always did. So yeah, it does open up some thorny questions. But this is part of his confession, part of his trust in God, and part of his belief that the powers of man are not as great as the power of God, and he trusts in that. To have closed that window would have been to deny that confession. Why the window open toward Jerusalem? Muslims pray facing Mecca, no matter where they are in the world. Christians do not pray facing Jerusalem. Why did Daniel?
Because it was home?
I think it was probably more than that, but yeah, it's good effort. Jerusalem was the home of the temple. This is where the presence of God had been manifested. The temple was still there. It was just in ruins. It was a heap of rubble. But it was the temple where God said he would make his presence known to humanity. So Daniel is actually doing a very sacramental kind of thing. He is aiming in the direction where God says his presence will be found, which is what the sacraments are all about. God says, I'm going to make my presence here in these things, so those are the things to which we go. Word and sacrament. So
The ark was in the temple, and that's where God dwelt between the angels' wings.
yeah, I wonder if at this point the ark wasn't in Babylon. It's hard to,
Right, but that's
because
where
Nebuchadnezzar,
that
but originally, yes.
God dwelt in Jerusalem.
Right. Originally so. So yeah, this is why I think, and it's not a law. This was never part of the Old Testament law that you had to pray facing Jerusalem. This is just Daniel's personal devotional practice. Note his posture. It says on his knees 3 times a day. Also, an ancient form of humble devotion that's still continued today. Next asterisk, there is no fear in his prayers. He prayed and gave thanks to God as he had always done before. Thanking God. You know, consider his circumstances. And it makes his thankfulness all the more important. His life is under threat now, and he knows it. And he's thanking God. And he's still a slave in Babylon along with all the rest of the Jews, and he's thanking God. You know, Israel as a nation doesn't really exist anymore. It's all been sacked and carried off into different parts of the world, and he thanks God. So in the midst of the worst circumstances, Daniel is still thanking God. It's an incredible lesson of what our devotion should look like. There's always a reason to thank God for something. We have another day of grace, even if everything else goes wrong today. We have his grace. We have eternal life. That never changes. All right, also the final note, final asterisk under that verse in the handout, 3 times a day. So again, this is Daniel's own devotional custom. This is not an Old Testament law that we have to pray 3 times a day, which is, again, the difference between us and the Muslims, who actually have a law that they have to pray 5 times a day on their knees facing Mecca. God does not make law out of the method of prayer. But Daniel's own personal devotional custom was 3 times a day. Why 3 times a day? There is another example of a 3-fold repetition of prayer by Elijah, where when he raises a young man from death, it says he stretched himself out over the young man and prayed 3 times, and then the 3rd time the young man came back to life. We also see a devotional, the Aaronic blessing in the Old Testament was a 3-fold blessing, which we still use. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you. You know, the Lord look upon you with grace and grant you his favor. That 3-foldness occurs in the devotion and the prayer of the Jews. Why? Why 3-fold? Again, I think obviously the triune God. This is their way of reverencing the Trinity of God. All right, let's press on. Try and get this done. 11 to 12. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God, and they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. So it says they assembled and found Daniel. The word assembled there is the same word we saw previously for tumult. So a raucous gathering. They are literally waiting right outside his window watching him. And when he does this, they break out. You know, this is a party for them. This is the answer to their prayers. They got him. So it's a tumult gathered outside his window. Which are petty little men. The next asterisk, top of the page. By citing the law, the king's sign, they can make it seem like their concern is simple legal justice and not a personal vendetta. It also makes Daniel's prayer look like it's a case of political rebellion against the king and his authority. Yeah, and that's how they frame it. You signed this law, didn't you? You know, this man is defying you. How dare he? It's all about sucking up to the king, looking good to him, and trying to turn his own words against him.
Well, and they were also then saying, now you have to do this because
Right.
we're pointing it out to you.
You are bound by your law to follow through.
And if you don't, you're going to lose all your credibility and everything else that goes with that.
That's right, exactly. Now his neck is on the line. Absolutely. Verse 13. So they answered and said before the king that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, that really exposes it right there. Daniel's a Jew. They hate Jews. And they don't even give him the credibility of being a Jew. It's a captive from Judah. You know, they're still invoking slave status on him. We're the governors. This slave, this person who should be bossed around, They despise everything about him and always have. This is just their opportunity to finally do something about it. And the way they frame it doesn't show regard for you or the law. The ultimate in rebellion. Verse 14 and 15, and the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. And then these men approached the king, and they said to the king, Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians, that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed. So Darius knows what he did, blames himself for not seeing through it. When you think about the fact, historically we know that the new ruler of Babylon was only in charge for a little over 2 years. So Darius does not have a long history, and these events are happening relatively soon after he sacks Babylon. And even in that amount of time, it's probably a matter of months, maybe weeks, probably months. Even in that amount of time, Daniel had so endeared himself, and Darius had such affection for him, such respect for him, that he genuinely is losing sleep about this. We would lose sleep over it because we're normal human beings, but these guys are not. The kings of Babylon, the rulers of Babylon, these guys, we don't have people like that in our world. I mean, they make Putin look like a lamb. They were violent, vengeful, murderous people when they wanted to be. And for him to have that kind of respect and affection for Daniel is an amazing thing. It really shows Daniel was an amazing man, that he engendered that kind of trust from a king within that short a period of time. And he knows they've got him with that whole law of Medes and Persians thing. He looks for any loophole he can. He probably called his legal experts in looking for loopholes, and there aren't any. If you establish something as a law of Medes and Persians, you're stuck with it. So verse 16 to 17, so the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, Your God whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. Then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signets of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. So Daniel's faith is well known even by this king who had only recently taken the throne. And Darius' statement, he will deliver you, is a curious statement of faith. It's more than just a wish. It's probably a wish, but he speaks it in such a way that it's more than that. Your God whom you serve continually, he will serve you, will deliver you. What a way to be known. The God whom you serve continually. How obvious Daniel's faith was in that godless world. People knew he served God continually. I don't know if only people would say that of us. It's such a profound thing to say about someone. He will deliver you. So Darius trusts Daniel's God as an unbeliever in a way. So as a polytheist, Darius can affirm Daniel's God, without denying his own God, because he believes in many gods. Your God whom you serve continually, not my God. So it's a curious statement of faith from a man who has no faith. Verses 18 to 19. Now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him. Also his sleep went from him. Then the king rose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions. So Darius shows himself to be a man of conscience. He both blames himself for the situation and worries for Daniel. No musicians were brought before him. Musicians is the nice, clean English version The word really is not definable in English. The word for musicians, it's really not musicians. Conjectures range all the way from food, which is how Luther interpreted the word, to instruments of music, to dancing girls and concubines. So it simply means diversions. So all the king's typical diversions, his entertainment, was kept away. He pushed it all away. He wanted to be left alone. So this deeply affected him. Okay, verse 20, and when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? He cried out with a lamenting voice. Now, if his previous statement to Daniel really was faith, your God will deliver you, he's approaching the lion's den thinking, yeah, but he probably didn't. He cries with a lamenting voice. He's expecting to find body parts and blood, not a living guy. So his sorrow is on his heart. He thinks the worst has happened. So did he really have faith previously? His faith, frankly, sounds a lot like ours, and even mine. I'll put myself in that. You pray for God to do something and help, and yet you approach a situation like, he probably isn't gonna. You prepare for the worst always. That seems to be the way our human weaknesses affect our prayers. God, please help me. I know you won't, but I'm just going to throw it out there. So that's kind of what Darius does here. Verse 20. We just read it, yeah. Daniel, servant of the living God. So the living God, this is the title he uses. As opposed to their dead gods. It's curious. It's a curious title. Because they're polytheists. So they have many gods. All their gods have names. And when he wants to talk about the God of Daniel, he has to distinguish Daniel's God somehow from all the other gods he knows about. And they don't have a name. They don't call him, the unbelievers do not call God Yahweh. So they don't know the divine name, evidently, or they don't use it. But the way they come up with for how do I set Daniel's God apart from all my other gods are these little adjectives they put in front of God. And here, Darius approaches Daniel and talks about the living God. It's an amazing thing for an unbeliever to be saying. He seems to recognize Daniel's God is actually living. That's the distinguishing factor of Daniel's God that sets him apart from all the other gods. And like in the previous chapter, when the queen approaches Belteshazzar, the ruler at the time, and talks about Daniel, this guy's a servant of the holy God. Another adjective. That's how it sets it apart. His God is holy. Ours, maybe not so much. And Nebuchadnezzar, when he addressed Daniel's God, it was the Most High God, the greatest of all gods. So these abject unbelievers and polytheists are putting all these little adjectives in front of the word God that are true. These are all good and correct titles for God. He's living. He's the holy God. He is the Most High God. There are even biblical titles that other biblical writers use. So it's an amazing thing that unbelievers are able to distinguish this about God, even coming from no faith at all. Now, as we'll see, there's something horribly lacking in their faith. But they do get that much. Verse 21 to 23. Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. Daniel uses the normal address. My God has sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, king, I have done no wrong before you. Then the king was exceedingly glad for him and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him because he believed in his God. So Daniel remains composed. He addresses the unfairness of the king's law very tactfully. He approaches the king with respect, with the typical royal greeting, "O king, live forever." But he says, "I was found innocent of wrongdoing before God, and I haven't done anything wrong to you." And that is a mild rebuke in a way. It's a gutsy thing for a guy to say to a king. I didn't do any wrong by you, and yet you threw me in here. He doesn't say the last part, but it's implied. So Daniel wasn't left unharmed, though, because he was innocent. He was left unharmed because he believed in his God. That last little bit at the end. No injury was found on him because he believed in his God. So God delivered him sheer by grace, not because Daniel was innocent or hadn't done anything wrong. Verse 24. Then the king gave command, and they brought all those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, and their wives. And the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. A story with a happy ending. Not the way it ever goes, that the enemies of God are, exposed and given their just deserts right then and there. But this is one of those rare times in history where it does happen. But now that shows you Darius. This was the caliber of man Darius was. He would wipe out co-conspirators and their whole families, children, wives, everybody. No mercy. So for a man like that, to have the sort of affection he had for Daniel, it's an amazing thing. It really shows Daniel's faith had attached him to Darius. Darius really saw the uniqueness of Daniel and treated him differently. Yeah.
Do you think part of it was Darius kind of saw Daniel as his lucky charm?
Yeah, as a polytheist, he probably was very superstitious.
Some of those guys had seen the power of our God. They'd seen what he can do, that he is living, do some of the miraculous things, and they wanted some of that power.
Yeah, I think that's probably exactly what the motivation is for these guys, for unbelievers and polytheists, why they would want somebody who believed in a different God close to them, because stuff happened. It was a lucky charm, like you say. Yeah, I think that's a lot of it. So on the handout now, again, the ferocity of the lions may suggest they were very hungry, which amplifies the miracle God worked with Daniel, or that God made them particularly vicious to show his judgment against those who would harm his own, or probably a little bit of both things are implied in that. Next, it was probably the main instigators who were punished. Not all of the satraps and governors were thrown in the den with their families. And this is an effective tactic. Identify the leaders and deal with them, and the rest will obey. So yeah, it was probably just the main instigators he found out and punished them as a warning to the rest. Dad always told me, my dad was a sergeant in the MPs, and he was occasionally sent into companies that were being divided and had a lot of trouble. And he said his main tactic he would use, which pretty much worked all the time, was find the main troublemakers and simply transfer them to a different unit. Get them out of there. So pick the instigators, deal with them, and the rest will obey, and that's what Darius does. Verse 25 to 27, we'll finish up. Then Darius wrote to all peoples, nations, languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you, and make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and steadfast forever. His kingdom is one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and he rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. Again, an amazing statement for an unbeliever to make. There's so much about God he gets, but one big glaring thing he doesn't. So compare on the handout, you've got Darius' statement on the right with Nebuchadnezzar's statement on the left. And you see a lot of similarity. They both speak of God's eternity. They both focus on his power. This is the God who does stuff, miracles. Both are true statements of God. And they both have the same huge hole. What do these statements about the true God lack? Okay, maybe they lack two things then. Right, they definitely don't distinguish him as the only God. They can say this about God and remain polytheists. But what else is missing here about the true God? Any statement of grace or mercy. They're impressed with power. They're praising God because of the miracles. They have no understanding of forgiveness, grace, of God promising to save humanity. There's no language of God as Savior. So unbelievers can know a lot about God, but without the Word, you'd never know about Christ and salvation. Let's close here. Last verse. So Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So there's a reference to Cyrus, who's the main Persian king, and Darius is kind of an under-ruler, showing that Daniel does in fact understand the power structure, and the biblical record understands it. So any questions, thoughts, or comments? All right, let's close with prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for bearing with us in our worst and for having mercy on us. And we pray that as the world becomes more and more evil, that you would stay with your people and strengthen them in their confession of faith in these evil times. And through them, as you did through your servant Daniel, bear witness to you in the world. For Jesus' sake, amen.